today's webinar with Plus at Plus as Plus celebrates 25 years of its existence. The topic for today's webinar is conservation after COVID-19, from unsustainability to inequality to revolutionary renewal. The conservation, particularly here in South Africa, is inherently political. Therefore, we cannot say that the issues of poverty, inequality, and race can be ignored. To challenge us on these issues, I have three speakers today steeped in the politics of conservation here in Southern Africa and also the worldwide. We have today Thembela Kepe, a professor in the Department of Geography, University of Toronto. Thembela is one of the first members, or was one of the first researchers to join PLAS when it was established in 1995. His research area is in land justice, political ecology, rural resistance, and politics of development. He has published widely in all these areas. And then we have Frank Matose, who is Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the Environment Humanities Director of Environmental Humanities South Center at University of Cape Town, South Africa. Frank's research interests are in political economy of conservation and commons in Africa. He is currently preparing a co-authored book titled Politics of Chronic Liminality, Forests and Power of the Marginalised in the Southern Africa. Frank is also a senior researcher at PLAS before moving to UCT. And then our third speaker is Bram Buscher. Bram is a professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change group at Wageningen University, the Netherlands. He is also visiting professor at University of Johannesburg, Department of Geography, Environment, Management, and Energy Studies, and a research associate at Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology, University of Stellenbosch. His research interests revolve around political economy of conservation and development, with particular interest in politics of nature, energy, extraction, ecotourism, new media, violence, and social theory, in which he has also published widely. Since we are celebrating 25 years of PLAS, I need to mention that all these three speakers continue to collaborate with PLAS in their various research projects. So starting with you, Bram. So what is the critical issues of conservation if we are to move from unsustainability to inequality? Bram?
Thank you very much, Mafa. And thanks everybody for tuning in to this seminar. I'm really excited to be here and share some thoughts together with my dear colleagues Frank and Thembela. Basically, I want to preface, my thoughts, or structure my thoughts here and my talk by pointing at three main elements. First of all, the effect that COVID-19 is having on the conservation world, and what the implications are of this and what that points at. That's the first thing. The second thing is to look at the need for revolutionary renewal. It sounds like a big term, but I feel that this is really a critical way to actually look at the challenges facing conservation and the way conservation needs to contribute to the challenges of the world more broadly. And thirdly, a couple of elements of what that may look like in terms of a conservation paradigm that we've proposed, entitled Convivial Conservation. Much of that comes from this book, The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene, that I've written with my dear co-author Rob Fletcher. And obviously, I won't be able to do any justice to what is in there, but I'll try to give a couple of hints on some of the issues that we describe. So first of all, COVID-19. Clearly, the pandemic has had a dramatic influence on all facets of life, really around the world, and conservation is no different. But actually, what I want to argue is that the pandemic has not necessarily laid bare any new issues, but rather exacerbated or put more sharply into focus different elements, different structural issues with conservation that were there already before the pandemic. And hence the idea for revolution, for real systemic transformation was already very clear before that. Now, we can look at two main issues within that, right? On the one hand, in relation to protected areas, and on the other hand, the relation between conservation and political economy, or capitalism more broadly. So, as COVID-19, is still making its way and its impact felt around the world, right? The idea is, from the conservation community, or one of the main ideas we see is that we need more protected areas, perhaps up to 30% of global terrestrial area, or even half of the entire global terrestrial area, to really prevent the sixth mass extinction crisis from reaching dramatic proportions. So these are some of the main ideas out there. Nature needs half Earth, 30% by 2030. But in the book and elsewhere, and with colleagues, we question whether this is actually a sustainable strategy going forward. Yes, of course, protected areas do save some species. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the way that the sixth extinction has intensified over the last 30 years, and perhaps 50 to 100 years, it coincided exactly with a rise of protected areas. So in other ways, the rise of protected areas has not hindered the very fact of the sixth extinction from arising. And I think that is an absolutely crucial point that I want to highlight. Right? So we can go up further with protected areas, as we have done over the last 20 to 100 years, but that in and of itself doesn't necessarily stop the biodiversity crisis. The other thing that has been tried is to make global conservation compatible with capitalism more broadly by neoliberalizing it and putting it into all kinds of market mechanisms, like tourism, like payments for ecosystem services, natural capital approaches, etc. Right? This is often seen as a realistic way to deal with species loss and biodiversity issues under the contemporary political economy. But again, the sixth extinction crisis, as the IPBES report made very clear last year, hasn't gone away but only intensified. But another thing is happening. If you make biodiversity legitimate based on market mechanisms, right? If it pays, it stays. What happens if nobody pays anymore? What happens if that market demand falls away, as we see with COVID-19 now with respect to tourism, right? So in South Africa as well, we see that all of a sudden there's a liquidity problem in many protected areas, but more broadly around the rest of the world, we see the same issue. So can we leave it to the market, right, to market mechanisms, to capitalism to save biodiversity? So my argument clearly is that we cannot, and COVID-19 shows this more clearly than it was already before. So then what? What is the next step? So my second point here is that we really need to think big, right? Conservation needs to step out of its own shadow, out of its shadow in the history of protected areas, and it's focused on integrating with capitalism as some so-called realistic option, but to really think big in terms of becoming part and parcel of a much broader structural transformation. And we think that can be done. right? So we think that conservation can be an important part of that structural renewal and structural transformation. But in order to do that, we need a new paradigm. So we suggest convivial conservation as a way forward to think about how to do that. Now, there are many different elements to that, and I won't be discussing that in any detail here, but very generic. There are two broad elements, and there are a couple of more specific issues that I think we can mention as first steps towards those two broader issues. So convivial conservation is an integrated strategy that combines humans and the rest of nature in sort of living and just landscapes. It doesn't set humans apart, but lives together with wildlife, right? In many ways, geographically, socially, and otherwise. So some human areas perhaps may become a bit more wilder, right? Cities need to be rewilded in many ways, but some wild areas may have to get used to people in various ways, as long as the needs of one don't outweigh the needs of the other. That's a very crucial sort of element to keep in mind. That has to be done in the second element, namely contextual element, namely a focus on degrowth, namely moving beyond economic growth as the structural pressure point that has led to the current biodiversity crisis. So in one way or the other, we have to tackle it. We can run away from it, but it won't solve the problem. It will only then get worse. Conservation needs to become part and parcel of the challenge towards economic growth and degrowing things that are completely unsustainable and perhaps stimulating those things that can be made compatible with biodiversity conservation. Lastly, on the ground, there are many things that we can do to move in that direction. The first is, and this is absolutely crucial and very practical, decolonizing conservation. We need to tackle inequality as we tackle unsustainability. The two go hand in hand. And that also means we need to tackle the race issue, gender issues, and class issues at the same time as we tackle the unsustainability, right, of the global political economic system. I won't be saying anything about it because I know that my colleagues will be speaking more about this, and particularly the issue of race, but I look forward to further being part of that discussion. Other things that we propose are a conservation basic income, so using basic income policies to allow people to live a meaningful life, and on that basis also allow them to become part of a broader discussion of a different development model that again balances the needs of people with the needs of non-human natures. Lastly, again, many more things could be mentioned, but really on the ground, we proposed different types of landscape models, financial models, and governance models, again, that focus on that not separating people and nature, but bringing them together, and not on market-based mechanisms, but for example, on insurance schemes or redistribution schemes, in order to, again, think about landscapes in a different way that allows them to develop a new sort of model going forward. Now, again, this is very broad still, and we can talk about this further in the discussion. But for now, I think my 10 minutes are up. So I would like to give the floor back to Mafa, and thank you all, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Bram, for that very deep and summarized sketching of what you think should be done. Without us wasting too much time, I'm not going to summarize what you have said, but we can do this later. Can I give the floor to Frank to talk to us about what he thinks the role of state and other actors should be in this kind of crisis when it comes to COVID and also conservation? Frank.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts in this space and with my colleagues, together with my colleagues. I just want to highlight a few issues in relation to the state. Bram talked much about the role of the market and economy in biodiversity economy and so on. But also he raised some issues in terms of COVID response. And in my contribution, I want to focus on the role of the state in the way it exercises power, which will lead us on to what Tembela is going to point out last. But let me start off also by pointing out what has been happening with the COVID response in terms of the role of the state in raising some of the issues that we are talking about today in terms of exacerbating inequality and unsustainability. How does the state exercise its power? Some of these things have been, brought to the fore much more through its state COVID responses. And I want to raise two particular points. One is in terms of the way the state exercises its power in terms of coloniality of power. In this regard, my colleague Bram was already talking about how states in Africa tend to exercise coloniality by their relations with the global north in terms of their relations, power relations with the global north, where ideas are just brought in from the north without exercising a sovereignty about the veracity of some of the practices that they take on board. And COVID response is one such example where we saw these global power relations at play in terms of solutions and responses of state. Instead of being homegrown and sovereign and African, they were just wholesale brought in without thinking through. And secondly, in terms of COVID responses, in terms of the knowledge, what knowledge, where is the knowledge coming from? Whose knowledge matters in state responses, which again raises issues about coloniality. And I think in conservation, you will see what the implications are in terms of whose knowledge counts. And then the third aspect, which I want to talk about, is this perpetual or continuity in terms of the way certain populations are treated by the state, which was very, not which was, but which is very vivid or vividly illustrated by the way the state treats populations. At the end of the day, it results in the marginalization, especially of rural populations and those in poorer areas, what we might call in South Africa townships, elsewhere in poorer suburbs and so forth. You would see in the COVID responses how there were just blanket responses in terms of how the state dealt with populations in those areas, which is really akin to the way natives were treated in colonial times. In other words, populations in these parts are treated as subjects rather than as citizens who are able to contribute to framing these responses to such a crisis. And I guess all of us who work in the conservation space, there are sort of resonances here in terms of how the state exercises its power in terms of these kind of problematic issues such as coloniality. Bram was already talking about the targets of 2030, about being 30 to 50% of protected areas and so on. Whose agenda is that? Is that African? Is that how resources should be conserved? And I'm sure in conservation space, this will be just taken wholesale. Whose targets are we meeting when we say, we want to protect so much space, this percentage of space? Is that really relevant in an African state? We're already conserving resources in different ways, away from this alienation of nature, this marginalization, which leads to the state exercising violence. The point I want to raise is the way the state marginalizes and leads to violence being perpetrated on populations through marginalization and the way power is exercised by the state. So, as Bram has already pointed out, this then calls on us to really sort of think differently and tackle issues around the way state exercises power to try to give back citizens voice, space, in being transparent, allowing for representation, allowing for greater participation of citizens, not only in formulating and crafting ways in which conservation takes place, but also in the way that conservation itself might benefit them more. Because conservation has to be really sort of questioned in the way power is exercised in these sort of places that are marginal or away, that are sort of in the periphery, even in terms of the way the states in Africa exercise power in these conservation spaces. They've allowed extra state actors who exercise power very differently without the central state knowing as much what is going on in these kind of spaces. If you look at Southern African states, for example, you could question the extent to which all sort of ruling parties have crafted any sort of policy, environmental policy, particularly in conservation space. It's an afterthought that is driven by agendas, again, that we were talking about, that represent this coloniality of exercise of power. So these need to be massively transformed and challenged and allow for other, for especially populations that are involved in conservation spaces to have voices, to take up their citizenship in these spaces. And I want to leave the rest of how this state exercises power, marginalizing people in these particular spaces. I hand over to Tembela to pick up on some of these issues that we raise around marginalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for keeping exactly at your time. I'm not that Bram went overboard. But before wasting too much time, I would like to welcome Tembela to react to this, especially when it comes to conservation and race. Tembela?
Thank you, Mafa. I'm actually not reacting to what Bram and Frank said. I'm saying my own thing, but it is, I see it as directly linked to what they said. I mean, I appreciate Bram kind of linking COVID-19 pandemic to a huge reminder all around about inequalities that continue to exist. So this is where I come in, because I see, like as the pandemic was going on, there were other struggles going on, only because we were reminded of the continuing inequalities, and the issue of race kind of came up big in North America, and it spread around the world as if it's something new. But those of us who've lived in these skins, it was not new, but it was an opportunity for us to engage with that issue. So let me kind of begin by saying, I mean, this is not an arguable point. I think I know that most of the debates within conservation that relate to people and conservation, they are all about the marginalized people. Otherwise, I mean, I can even venture to argue that if there were no marginalized people, we wouldn't have people in conservation debate. There would be no headaches, So I would also argue that most of these marginalized people are in the global south, and they are racialized. So it is why, like I've said this in the past in some of my publications, it is confusing, baffling to see that race is not central to conservation debates. Even if we started talking about it 50 years ago, it is still not central. I actually argue that any mention of race in conservation, in fact, mentioning race issues anyway is kind of often seen as taboo. It's worse in conservation, even though there are direct links between race and the history of conservation almost all over the world. So I am going to talk about a taboo here, but I like talking about taboos because they make people kind of stand up and listen and kind of ask themselves questions or get angry. You know, anger sometimes is a good response if it makes you react and want to do something. So COVID-19 has indeed, shown us that we live in an unequal world, and we've known this. You know, when there's war, people who suffer the most are the marginalized people. When there's a natural disaster, tsunami or an earthquake, most of the people who suffer long-term are marginalized people. And I'm really trying to tie marginalized people here with race, because most of the marginalized people are racialized people. So I'm arguing here today that conservation needs to embark on a journey, and that journey needs to be honest and authentic. If we in conservation are going to take race seriously, we need to keep up with what's going on in society. I'm saying this because over the last few weeks, when there was this awakening, especially in North America, around race as a result of the killing of George Floyd and many other people, is that I started listening. I mean, I'm a Black person, but I started listening, and I was actually inspired by all the lessons and actually reminders of how racialized people want to be talked about or want others to engage in the debate and so on. So sometimes I think we take shortcuts in dealing with issues of race, and conservation is probably the worst in kind of taking shortcuts. We think that inclusion and just making sure that local people benefit and co-management, you name many of the strategies, I think those are shortcuts because we're not listening, we're not observing what's happening outside or how people talk about race. You know, we don't even know how to talk to a racialized person without offending them, or we don't even know when we're offending them, right? So these are the issues that I feel, need to be talked about in conservation. Denying that conservation has a race problem is a problem. I'm saying that, and I'm not ashamed to say it. You know, I have a few examples that I want to kind of pick on here. One, to kind of illustrate my point about how we will let the debate go on outside of conservation and we're not keeping up with race. We'll never address race issues if we don't keep up and actually listen. I'll make one example. I mean, I've met many colleagues, white colleagues, who would say, Tembela, we don't see your race. To me, you're just a person. I don't want to use a vulgar term, but I feel like telling them, shut up, because you actually do see my skin color. And by saying you don't see my race, you're actually insulting me. If you say I'm not Black, I don't see that you're Black, that's insulting. I want to be seen as Black. You know why? Because as a Black person, I've lived in this skin. I have a history of being marginalized, being humiliated. I have a history of having things taken from me, including my dignity and so on. So when you say you don't see my skin color, it means you're actually denying that history, right? And I feel it is time to actually bring that to conservation and say, don't be ignorant to this history and how racialized people might want to be treated or viewed, because we know who we are. It's time that you know who we are too by listening. So one other example that I kind of want to bring up, I draw from a legal scholar who lives in Chicago. Her name is Benedict Atwahan. And she argues that when something is taken from you, I mean, this includes during the colonization process in Africa and other parts, when something is taken from you as a person of color, like as a racialized person, you are humiliated. Your dignity is taken away. And if we fast forward 200, 300 years or even 50 years forward, and you are being included, you are told you are part of this, the assumption is made that you are ready. Nobody pays attention to what Atwahan calls social death or social invisibility. So how can you include a person who's socially dead because the past, the ancestors took away their dignity or took away the dignity of my ancestors and so on and so on. So she's arguing that in all these projects, all what Frank was talking about, what Bram was talking about, to be included or to be made part of these things, it has to be recognized that we are talking about people who've been humiliated all their lives, who are socially dead, and I mean, we are working to be alive, but the argument that is made is that let's not make assumptions that people are ready. We need to engage in processes that acknowledges the history of marginalization. Okay, so I'm going to kind of end by making a call to all of us who work in the space of conservation. By the way, I work in the space of conservation. I teach courses on conservation. Some people might find it laughable, but I enjoy it. But I teach my students to actually know the truth. And for me, the truth is we need to talk about everything. No taboo. No topics are taboo. So, some people might feel guilty when we talk about race, or they might feel judged. And I say, don't. If you feel uncomfortable, you are in the right moment, because that's where you learn. If you feel angry, you're in the right moment, because that's when you'll engage in a journey of anger that will lead you to learning. So I would argue that if you are in a privileged position because of your skin color, right? Because skin color does give us privileges, or doesn't give them. And white skin has privilege. Okay, I know that's a taboo thing to say, but it is. So if you are privileged, use your privilege to fight against underprivilege. These are not my words. I heard them on TV because I watch a lot of news. Use your privilege to help fight against underprivilege. It's not going to stop. So in conservation, don't just be happy because people are included, there's co-management, there's all of these things. Try to keep up with what society is doing outside of conservation about race. There's a lot to learn. I have many of these points that I've written down, like I want to call them a manifesto for dealing with race and conservation, but I'm not going to share them here and now, hopefully in the future. But I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping that if you've been moved by what I said, talk to me and ask me questions. And yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. to Bram, Frank, and Tembera. They have introduced quite a number of topics, and I can see that there's a lot of questions and also debate going on in the chat room. So maybe we can start with some of the issues and questions that people are raising. Bangi, can you start with putting up some of the questions that are coming up? There is a question there from Junaid Francis, is one of our students at PLUS. He's talking about conservation, whether we can reimagine in terms of areas. Can it support inclusive governance of natural resources and also protect it against capital interests? I don't know which one of you wants to take that one. Tembera, Bram? Bram?
Yeah, thanks, Mafa. Good question. I think the struggle to move beyond protected areas and the struggle to rethink capitalist interests or to try to, in the end, overcome capitalist interests is one and the same, right? It's one and the same, but it's an historical process, I would say. So one thing we're not saying in the book is that immediately you can give up all protected areas around the world, perhaps without indeed a massive further collapse of biodiversity. But what we suggest is an historical process of re-embedding protected areas within their broader social, political, and economic context and environment. And in that process, rethinking the needs of people and the needs of non-humans, of animals and ecosystems together. And that inherently must go with the, overcoming and challenging particular type of capitalist interests. Now, obviously, capitalist interest is a big thing, right? The political economy of capitalism has historically developed itself over 400 or 500 years and won't go away overnight. And so it will be targeted specific elements that need to be rethought and challenged. But for example, why not start with one particular element, namely tourism, right? A big capitalist industry that in a certain way, right, seems to support conservation, but is not a sustainable global industry at all, where people fly around the world, contribute to climate change, use a lot of gas and oil to go around protected areas. So how can we rethink that? Let's maybe take one of these as a starting point, draw lessons from that, and then further that process of re-embedding.
Thank you, Bram. The next two questions relate to campfire, and probably Frank, you could deal with them. Bangi? It says campfire hasn't really worked, and one of the reasons is because state, and there's another one from Maniba Isaacs. Frank?
Both questions, thank you. Both questions point to some of the experiments of the state, and in terms of they were funded or they were proffered as if, if you talk about community-based natural resource management, and campfire being one example of it, in terms of the state sort of or actors within the conservation space, putting it forward as if, now we have solved the problem of joint management or not including communities around conservation spaces. But, there's nothing, there was no structural transformation in those spaces or in those approaches of managing those kind of spaces, in the sense that is the program that I was partly involved in, the Responsive Forest Governance Initiative, illustrated those kind of work in terms of the lack of inclusivity, no democratic citizenship adhered within that kind of, within those kind of initiatives. It was a continuation of treatment of people in those spaces as natives, as subjects, without necessarily working with democratic institutions within those neighboring spaces. Take, for example, there are elected councillors next door to protected areas, be they national parks or forests or whatever you may want to call them, you know. And so you create community systems that are parallel. You know, in other words, you are not only having a protected area as an enclave of protected species, but also an enclave of working with communities or populations in those areas as an enclave, but they live in a wider society where rights are exercised. But in this case, you know, the way rights are exercised, they are taken away from them and exercised through extra state actors instead of working with through elected representatives, through formal structures of the state. This is why I was talking about this coloniality of power within these kind of conservation spaces. And that's one issue that requires systemic transformation.
Thank you, Frank. There is a question or a comment from Swatu Bangi on marginalized Bangi. Okay, thank you. Tembera, can you deal with this? There are two questions around the issues of conservation and marginalized, that the marginalized occupy centralized physical spaces, governments, companies, and income interests, but yet they do not really benefit from conservation. So this is a comment and also a question that you could also comment on. Tembera?
Yeah, but what's the question? I didn't. What's the question? Because I agree with this.
So you could comment and substantiate some of the comments that are being put forward.
Okay. Anyways, okay. Thanks, Larry, for the question. Well, I kind of agree with you, and this is the nature of marginalization, in the sense that those who work hard, those who actually are burdened with the cost of whatever, it could be conservation and so on, tend to benefit less. This is the nature of things. And like if I kind of try to bring this to race, this has been the life of racialized people. Even if we look at it at the larger scale of things, not only in conservation, the West is well developed and well resourced because they've taken away from the global South, from these people who are now seen as a burden to society. Africa has given so much to the world, and the world that has kind of developed. When they say, "Oh, do how we've done," like in the modernization line of thinking, how can we be like them because they took from us, right? That's what I tell my students. So in terms of conservation, this makes sense that those who are there locally don't get much, but those who are out there are coming all from there to kind of take. I'm just trying to put it in a lay person's terms because that's what it is. This thing of trying to couch these injustices in kind of flowery academic language or sensitive language doesn't help. Sometimes we need to call a spade a spade. People steal and other people suffer. And it happens to be the marginalized people who suffer. And I've already said most of the marginalized people are racialized people. I'm kind of going to leave it as controversial as that may be.
Okay, thanks very much, Tembera. The next question is from AJ. Bangi, can you put it up, please? So this is around underfunding of environment because it's considered a public good as much as. So how do we do this if we are going to reimagine conservation when it comes to funding conservation? Bram, you also talked about the basic income, something. Can you please elaborate a few issues around this in terms of basic income grant or something like that?
Yeah, this is a very important question, and we recently had a discussion with the Schumacher Center for a New Economy and with others, exactly trying to imagine what does commons finance look like. Because of course, with a particular type of capitalist finance comes, all kinds of cultural ways of doing and behaving, and all kinds of attitudes in terms of investment and trying to get more out of it, that we need to also then move beyond. But the first thing, it's actually very simple, right? The economy ultimately is about distributing different types of resources and benefits. At the moment, it's being redistributed upward, right? COVID-19 again shows incredibly clearly that in a space of less than 2 months, where in the US, for example, 40 million people lose their jobs, the richest, I don't know how many, 1% or so, gain 400 odd billion US dollars. It's insanity. It's crazy. We need massive redistribution. The point is not that there's not enough money in the world to finance this. There's plenty of money going around. It's just being hoarded by too few people, and these few people have not earned, all this money, right? They are there because of particular positions, and they use their power literally to lobby governments and others to favor, the rules of the game in this redistribution upwards. We must fight for a different type of redistribution. With that, right? And as Tembela said, people have been dispossessed, for hundreds of years under global capitalism. We must dispossess the wealthy. We must create a massive, massive wealth tax, right? That if you earn above, let's say, 2 million, that's still a lot of money, but that's nothing compared to what Jeff Bezos currently earns, right, per day or per week or per minute, and use that as a public good to finance, to properly finance and give back to the people that have been dispossessed, for decades, if not, centuries, to start living a decent life. And in fact, I think we will be doing the wealthy a favor, because they don't have to worry too much about, all the money that they might lose, because they've already lost it. And, other people can live decent lives, so that these things are a little bit more in balance. I don't think that sounds like a radical thing at all, right? Some people say that that's radical. I think the current inequality, that is radical in terms of extreme. We need something completely different, and that starts with redistribution.
The next question is from AJ again, and can you put it up, Bram? Sorry. Okay, it's from Frank Matose. It says, Frank Matose, what examples of local exercise of power other than colonizing state power in a service of conservation can you offer us as a starting point to build alternative models on?
Okay. Thank you, Terna, for your question. Yeah, we have to remember that Africa is replete with examples of conserving. I'm not trying to romanticize other ways of conserving. This is an alien form of conservation when you set up enclaves, when conservation is put up in these kind of blocks. But it doesn't mean that a particular tree species, a particular animal species, particular water points, and so on, are still conserved outside of this model that is largely alien, that is also very exclusive. It's almost a privatized public good, instead of that good being managed for the good and greater welfare of the society in which that resource or particular species is found. So we need to find ways of engaging with that form of conservation, and where the exercise of power is locally based in terms of decision making. Colleagues in the commons space have written several papers. I was involved in a chapter with colleagues in the Handbook of Commons that was published by Routledge in 2019 already, that talks a lot about these other ways of governance and exercise of power outside of this of these systems that we are so used to in the conservation spaces. The point is, we need to reimagine how the state and how conservation can really be managed without necessarily putting enclaves, without putting protected areas, and yet species are conserved. Here in our own spaces in urban areas, as we talk, there are butterfly species that fly around, and they are conserved, and we interact with that nature. They're birds and so on, but they are not in enclaves. And as a citizen, I have rights over those kind of species. Why can't we use the same sort of concept elsewhere? But again, it goes to this fundamental issue that Tembela is raising about marginalization and racialized and treating people in certain spaces as non-citizens, which needs to be challenged and fundamentally transformed.
Thank you, Frank. The next question or comment is from AJ again. Can you put it up, Bangi, please? This is about levels of racial illiteracy that are terrible in the sector, and transformation issue is not adequately dealt with. What can you comment about this, Tembela?
Okay, so I agree, and I'm happy that somebody else acknowledges that literacy about race issues is lacking in the sector. But I would actually try to argue that is probably not transformation that we need. We need a revolution, because sometimes transformation is a softer version of change. We need a revolution, and it is amazing. I'm happy that I'm getting some questions here already. But talking about race is not an easy thing. It's worse in conservation. So there's a need for rethinking. There's a need for engaging in a journey of learning, cultural change, and all of those things. I was listening to the previous question that Frank responded to. Sometimes I worry about how we go for prescriptions, for blueprints, for tell us what to do, and so on and so on. I would argue that racialized people have no responsibility to teach other people to be anti-racist. The people need to enter that journey themselves. You need to come to a point where you say, okay, something needs to change. Let me learn. Let me listen, and so on. And those are usually the beginnings of transformation, or what I would call a revolution. We need to change things radically. If we don't, we're going to be in the same place 50 years to come. And I'm not angry. I'm just saying these things because that's the truth.
Yes, you are just being passionate, which is what we all like about you. The next question, probably the last for this webinar, before the speakers start wrapping up, is from Chikondi. Can you put it up, Bangi? Mwangi, you took it off again. Okay, so it says what mechanisms of redistribution could be instituted to ensure the marginalized really benefit from resources? I'm not going to, anybody, the three of you who thinks they want to take this one? Frank? And Bram? Yeah, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Chikondi, for that question. Tembele was already talking about, a reimagined, or it was Bram earlier who was talking about a reimagined future. One of the ways in which we can reimagine and build up on already existing practices outside of state centralized provisioning systems. People already have a system of care and welfare and provisioning that builds from commons, shared. I think we in Africa, we have gone too much for these sort of neoliberalized market-based economies and so on, as ways of provisioning. I'm not saying they are not valid, but we need both ends, where I think, especially under COVID-19, we've learned a lot about how people have come together and shared resources, the limited resources that were available. And it goes back to how commons or commoning is practiced outside of these formal spaces and formal state provisioning systems. And this is what we need to build on. It's one of the ways in which we can begin to unlearn and change ways on which we're of provisioning and sharing, rather than accumulating and dispossessing and end up marginalizing other people. So we can revert to that ways of common provisioning. It's a huge issue that we can have a discussion on its own, and I'm glad Plus is actually having another webinar on commons, and I hope they can take how commons can be a source of redistribution or provisioning that is not centralized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to give each of you a minute or just a half a minute to wrap up and say what your last messages or your last words could be to the people who are tuned in. Can I start with the reverse order now, Tembele?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I'm first. So the last word that I want to leave is that if you're reluctantly engaging in kind of thinking about race and conservation, just don't do it. It's going to look bad, right? I mean, look at Donald Trump, for example. Whenever he tries to say something that's supposed to be politically correct, it just blows up. So I encourage you, don't just check the box. Make it a permanent lifestyle to consider race in your work, okay? Because racialized people are going nowhere. They are here to stay, so we might as well make it a lifestyle in conservation in particular. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tembele. Frank, what are your last words on the issue of COVID-19 conservation and also moving towards a revolutionary renewal?
Okay. A revolutionary renewal would take the form of rethinking the state in Africa. We are, however, many years from post-colony, but are we post-colonies? Our state reflecting the fact that they have sovereignty. I'm not so sure in conservation spaces, are states exercising their power in manners that endear them to citizens. That is the challenge. That is the revolution that is required in conservation spaces and responses to disasters such as COVID-19. It may be natural disasters, other natural disasters. My call here is that the state needs to unpack itself how it exercises power in relation to certain populations and ensure that they are citizens, and not just rush into these violent responses that lead to further marginalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Bram, what are your last words?
I would like to say that I think conservation, even though it's long been, and it doesn't really recognize that, but long been part of the problem rather than solution, can really become part of the solution for broader transformation. But it has to do a couple of things. First of all, imagine that we can actually have revolutionary renewal, right? Open up the imagination to think change in broad terms. Second, real material political struggle, right? On all levels, class, gender, race. And the last thing is, and I think Ruth mentioned that before, that gender is an important, absolute vital element of this. And this was an all-male panel, which I normally don't do, and I think none of us. So it should be mentioned that this shouldn't have been perhaps like this, and hopefully next time we can do a little bit better.
Very much, Brown, Tembera, and Frank, for your insightful views and leading this conservation and debate. I would like to thank all of you who tuned in to another PLUS webinar. Next week's webinar is on land inequality and COVID-19. Please look out for the title of the actual title and also the summary. Until next week, bye-bye and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for watching, everybody.